And welcome back, listeners. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. And I'm super excited about continuation from our last podcast. And if you got a chance to listen to the last podcast, you're probably on the edge of your seat also. If you haven't, make sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and go check that one out, because preemptively, it's going to really tie in to this one really, really nicely. So, as is normal, I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby, coming in from Kansas City during World Cup, 4th of July week. The whole thing is going on in the country right now. How are you guys doing?
Recovering still from the loss of Netherlands in the World Cup, but ready to cheer on Canada. And don't forget, tomorrow's Canada Day. I have my Canada mug right here next to me. So you all talk about the 4th of July, but July 1st is first.
For those that are looking for a reason to celebrate, that's not hard to find, right? So it's a good time of the year right now between baseball and the World Cup, and obviously you're right in the throes of, golf season and the whole thing. So, Dr. Matt, you shared a little bit with us something that's really, really cool about you got your Dr. Matt bobblehead doll.
I do. It's right back here over my right shoulder, and I got that as a gift from a very close friend named Pam Gibbons. Give a shout out to her. And yeah, it was just a surprise. She got a picture from Joanne from the commencement. Pam did attend, drove all the way up from Chicago just to attend Chicago to Madison, Wisconsin, to attend the commencement, and just an honor to have her there to be with Joanne during the celebration. So it was just, fantastic surprise. And I got my own bobblehead. So
Pretty cool.
first time ever. So now we have that, as I was joking, 2 bobbleheads in the screen. And so hopefully it'll be a little bit more entertaining than maybe some of the technical things we've talked about in the past. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I know we definitely get technical, and just to kind of sort of jump right into it. Over the last several episodes, we've been following a thread that I honestly didn't see coming. Now, it started with a pretty simple observation: risk assessments weren't really designed to assess fiduciary discretion. Then we realized something even bigger. Maybe fiduciary risk isn't simply the risk of a bad outcome. Maybe fiduciary risk begins much earlier. Maybe, just maybe, it's the risk that fiduciary discretion itself becomes distorted. Then we asked another question: how does a profession learn? Does it simply collect experience? Right? Of course, it collects experience, but that can't be the only thing. Or does it somehow transform experience into knowledge that future generations can use? Today, I think we're ready for an even bigger question. One that isn't really about fiduciaries at all. It's about professions. Joanne, Dr. Matt, welcome back. Let's jump on into it. Matt, you've been leading us down this path for several episodes now. First, risk assessments, then fiduciary risk, then experience, then knowledge. Where are we headed?
well, Carter, it's, the basis of our podcast here is the invisible threat. And so we've talked about things that basically have been hiding in plain sight, not because anyone intended to hide it, but it's invisible. And it's because we rarely stop. We talked about this in our discussion last week as well. Professionals rarely stop to reflect on how things actually evolve, especially how they got to the positions that they're in right now.
Yeah, for sure. And for you listeners, I don't know about you, but I'm on the edge of my seat. I can't wait to see where this is going. So I hopefully they're as intrigued as I am.
So let's walk through this. And let me suggest that every profession has institutions. Carter, would you agree?
Obviously, right? Medicine, right? They have hospitals or medical schools and professional associations, the licensing boards. I think about the CFP all the time. Law has law schools, bar associations, all right? The courts, Engineering has engineering schools, professional societies, licensing boards. Accounting has universities, right? We even have Epic University, right? CPA societies, standard setting bodies. Sure, every profession has institutions.
So I think we agreed. Now, let me ask a different question. Why do they have institutions? Why do professions develop the institutions in the first place?
Well, I mean, I'd garner a guess that because no profession can survive, with people working completely, totally independently, right? Eventually, they have to organize, or it wouldn't be an actual profession, right?
That's a great observation, Carter. Institutions make professions possible. Imagine medicine without medical schools, or law without bar associations, or engineering without standards. Decisions would be random, knowledge wouldn't accumulate, and every generation would have to start over.
That makes logical sense, right? So institutions determine standards and preserve what the profession has already learned.
Yes, they preserve the knowledge along with the know how. They teach it, standardize it, transfer it. Those are some of the most important things that institutions can do.
But I think here's what's interesting. Not all institutions perform the same function.
Okay, meaning,
Well, think about the fiduciary profession, the thing that we're talking about all the time. Some institutions in the fiduciary world primarily educate. They develop practitioners, they teach accepted practice. Other institutions in the fiduciary world bring the practitioners together. They'll host conferences, facilitate discussions, and share ideas. Others establish expectations. They issue guidance, oversee conduct, protect the public. Each one of those institutions performs a different function or a different role.
And they're all important. You would not want a profession without education, or without standards, or without opportunities for people to get together and exchange ideas. Those functions reinforce one another.
yeah, so far, this all sounds pretty straightforward. So every profession builds institutions because institutions help that profession mature.
Exactly right. Now comes the question that changed everything for me.
Okay, I can make a safe assumption, but what was it?
Which institution actually creates new knowledge? Not teaches existing knowledge, not the one that shares the experience, not regulates practice. Which one creates new knowledge?
Yeah, and honestly speaking, I've never really even thought about that. And maybe it's because for as long as I've even been in the financial services industry, it's kind of sort of like been like established SOPs, I guess, if you will, right? Standard operating procedures. So I've never really even thought about that.
Well, Carter, you're not alone. Most people haven't. Even for me, it was interesting having Matt going through his process of getting higher education through the dissertation and starting to realize, oh my gosh, he's creating new knowledge. And that's because most of the time, the professions spend their energy applying what they already know. I've been in the fiduciary industry a long time, and I've always done that. I've always absorbed information, shared what I know, but it's learning from what was already there. And I think the assumption is that today will look enough like yesterday that accumulated experience will continue to serve us well tomorrow.
Wait there just one second, Joanne. That was profound. And I think you need a little bit slower this time, right? I know you're excited about this, especially with Dr. Matt and his dissertation and, creating new knowledge, which I love too. But share that again with us a little bit slower, please.
So I think in the industry, the assumption is that today will look enough like yesterday that accumulated experience will continue to serve us well tomorrow.
And think about it. For long periods of human history, that assumption was largely true. Change happened very, very slowly. Experience accumulated, knowledge remained useful for decades, sometimes for generations.
Yeah, but that's not the environment we're operating in anymore.
No truer words, Carter. Today's fiduciaries face questions that didn't even exist 10 years ago. How do we use artificial intelligence under full discretion? Can we administer digital assets? What is the impact of cross border wealth on the estate plan? Can we apply algorithmic decision support to an irrevocable trust? These aren't simply new regulations, they're fundamentally new conditions that never existed before, requiring the exercise of fiduciary discretion. And experience alone is not sufficient to answer them.
Yeah, yeah. So right there, that's the difference. Experience tells us what was done in situations we've already encountered, but it can't provide answers to questions we have not ever faced before.
And that's the turning point. Every profession eventually reaches the point where preserving yesterday's knowledge is no longer sufficient. It must also create tomorrow's knowledge. And once a profession reaches that point, it has to ask a very different question. Not what do our experts know, but who is responsible for discovering what nobody knows yet?
I think I'm starting to see the distinction, right? Professional associations, training organizations, regulators, they all have different responsibilities, but none of those responsibilities necessarily includes creating new knowledge, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's a perfect description. And that's not a criticism to them. It's actually evidence that the profession has matured. Every institution evolved to solve a particular problem. Education prepares practitioners. Professional associations connect the practitioners. Regulators protect the public. Each performs an essential function. The interesting question isn't whether they're doing their jobs, it's whether every important job has been assigned to someone.
And historically, that was not a problem. For most of the fiduciary profession's history, experience accumulated faster than the profession changed. A trust officer could spend 20 or 30 years developing their expertise. Then they could pass along that experience to the next generation of trust officer that started working for their organization, and then they could safely retire knowing they had passed that along. That has worked remarkably well for the industry in the past.
Yeah, sure, because, the problem stayed relatively consistent.
Exactly. The governing principles remained stable. The trust documents looked familiar. Investment practices have evolved, but they did so gradually. Beneficiaries were different, obviously, across all the different families and trusts, but always recognizable. The profession could rely on experienced practitioners because experience remained relevant for a very long time.
But notice what's changed. The pace of change has accelerated, not because fiduciaries suddenly became less capable, but the environment became more complex. Questions now emerge that no generation of fiduciaries has previously encountered.
Yeah, and we've talked about this on the show, and this is very much in the daily lexicon. The application of AI, artificial intelligence.
And that's one example. Think about the questions fiduciaries are beginning to ask. Can artificial intelligence assist in the exercise of discretion? And trust administration. Should it summarize beneficiary communications? Should AI recommend distributions? Should AI identify risk? Should AI draft committee memoranda? Should AI participate in committee deliberations? None of those questions existed when many of these trust officers currently entered their careers.
Or consider digital assets. How should fiduciaries safeguard cryptocurrency? How should digital wallets be administered? What authority exists over digital identity? How should beneficiaries access digital property? Again, these are not simply administrative or operational questions. They are questions involving the exercise of fiduciary discretion.
Yeah, and if no one has decades of experience with this new stuff, where do the answers? Where are they going to, end up coming from?
Perfect. That's exactly the question. For decades, experience was enough. Today, experience is still essential, but experience alone cannot answer these questions because they have never been encountered before.
So, what's the profession to actually do then?
What it has always done, it gathers experienced professionals together.
Together, like conferences, right? Roundtables, committee meetings, right? That's probably pretty normal. Working groups, I'm assuming.
Of course, well, that's the start. Someone presents a difficult problem. Everyone shares what they've tried. The group identifies promising practices, and people return to their institutions with new ideas. That's an incredibly valuable process.
And that's because experience deserves to be shared. If one institution discovers a better way to communicate with beneficiaries, others should learn from it. If someone develops a stronger committee process, the profession benefits when that experience is exchanged. Knowledge sharing makes everyone better.
But you're going to tell me that's still not research.
You know me well, Carter, because the question research asks is very different. Knowledge sharing asks, what are experienced professionals doing? Which is what we were just talking about. Research asks, what do we have to discover that nobody knows yet? Those are fundamentally different questions.
Well, I'm hoping for the listeners' sakes and for mine, you can give me an example.
Of course, suppose fiduciaries across the country are trying to determine whether artificial intelligence should be used in discretionary distribution decision. A knowledge sharing discussion might ask, who's experimenting with AI? People raise their hands and start the discussion. What policies have you written already? Another discussion happens. What controls have been implemented? What risks have you identified? Those are all excellent and necessary questions, but they're all describing what currently exists.
And research asks something else. Does AI influence how fiduciaries exercise discretion? And if it does, how does it do that? Does AI improve consistency? Does it unintentionally reinforce cognitive bias? Does AI reduce meaningful committee discussion? Does AI encourage overconfidence? Under what conditions does it improve fiduciary decision making? Under what conditions does it weaken it? Those are not experience questions, those are research questions.
And those answers don't already exist.
Those answers do not already exist. They're waiting to be discovered, which means they can't simply be collected. They have to be created.
I think this is where I finally understand the last two episodes, right? Experience belongs to individuals, but knowledge doesn't simply appear because experienced people gather in the same room or some same groups. Somebody has to deliberately, intentionally create it.
Carter, I've said this numerous times. You are so, so good in the way that you explain things. That's exactly the distinction. Experience is indispensable for sure, but experience and knowledge are not the same thing. Knowledge is what remains after experience has been examined, questioned, tested, compared, refined, and demonstrated in ways that others can understand, challenge, and build upon. That's how professions mature and advance.
Which explains something that's puzzled many people. Why do the same difficult fiduciary questions seem to return year after year? It's not because the profession is not working hard. It's because some questions cannot be answered by accumulating more experience. Eventually, they require systematic investigation.
Maybe we've been expecting experience to perform a job that only research can perform.
Carter, another brilliant observation. And once you see that distinction, that we've been expecting experience to do a job that only research can perform, you begin looking at the profession very differently. Not because anything is broken, but because you begin noticing that a function that has never really had a home. And that's why we call this episode The Missing Institution.
Here's what I'm going to try to do. And listeners, thank you again for joining us for another episode of The Invisible Thread. So let me see if I can summarize where we've arrived. Every profession develops institutions. Some educate, some regulate, some connect practitioners, some preserve professional knowledge. But eventually, somebody has to discover knowledge that doesn't yet exist.
Perfect. And that's where professions begin to change. Not because the old institutions stop working, but because the profession begins asking questions that can't be answered by any of the existing institutions. They were not built and designed to perform research.
And the fiduciary profession is currently confronting issues that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. Artificial intelligence, obviously, being one of them, digital assets, complex family governance, global wealth, longevity, behavioral science, new expectations from beneficiaries. Each of those developments creates new situations requiring fiduciary discretion. And even though these things are current in the industry, the regulations are still trying to catch up. Law firms are looking to courts or other firms for answers. At conferences, I've noticed professional fiduciaries asking each other what other trust companies, what their own trust companies are doing or thinking of doing, or if they're deciding what they are not going to do. It's like, oh, we're not even going to get involved in that until things settle down.
Yeah, we've talked about that before, right? Well, we can do this. Should we do this, right? Which means tomorrow's fiduciaries can't simply inherit yesterday's answers.
Well, they'll inherit the principles, they'll inherit the values, and they'll inherit the professional standards. But many of the questions they'll face, they've never been answered before. And that's true of every profession that experiences rapid change.
So then what happens when a profession reaches that point?
Yeah, I think that history gives us a pretty consistent answer. Eventually, professions begin investing in research, not because experience loses value, but because experience alone is no longer sufficient to keep pace with the change.
Think about the field of medicine. Physicians still rely on experience, but medicine does not advance because experienced physicians gather once a year and exchange stories. Medicine advances because observations become hypotheses, hypotheses become research, and research becomes evidence. That evidence becomes education, and education then becomes practice. That's a knowledge ecosystem.
Yeah, well, I mean, and engineering really works the same way.
Well, mature professions, right? Accounting, economics, agriculture, aviation. Virtually every maturing profession eventually develops a process for creating knowledge, not simply transferring it.
Yeah, so maybe the institution we've been missing, right, as this podcast is known to be, is not necessarily a building or an organization, right? Maybe it's a function.
Yeah, once again, I think you're exactly right. The missing institution isn't defined by its name, it's defined by its purpose. Its purpose is asking the questions that experience alone simply cannot answer.
Yeah, sure. Like, I mean, questions as an example, like how does artificial intelligence influence the exercise of fiduciary discretion, right? How should committees, deliberate when AI participates in information gathering? Or how do fiduciaries exercise discretion over digital assets? It's a very that's very much, you know, in today's world that we're dealing in, right? And what organizational environments strengthen discretionary judgment? Which governance practices unintentionally distorted?
Or even more fundamental questions. How do exceptional fiduciaries actually exercise discretion? Can that process be observed? Can it be measured? Can it be taught? Can institutions strengthen it? Those are not merely practical questions, they are questions about the profession itself.
And it's important to note that research is not about replacing professional wisdom, it's about expanding it. Experience tells us what has happened. Research helps us understand why it happened, whether it will happen again, and what we should expect next.
All right, so I have to admit, when we started this conversation, I thought this episode was going to be about creating another organization. Now, I don't think that's what it's all about at all.
Yeah, right again, Carter. It's about recognizing a responsibility. Every profession that we've talked about eventually reached the point where preserving yesterday's knowledge is no longer enough. It must also anticipate and create tomorrow's knowledge. The interesting question isn't whether fiduciary practice will reach that point. The interesting question is whether we're already there.
And if we have, the opportunity is extraordinary. Imagine a profession where discretionary judgment can be studied, where difficult fiduciary questions become research projects instead of recurring debates, where experienced practitioners can work alongside researchers, where discoveries can become education, where education will strengthen the practice, and where each generation leaves the next generation with more experience and it will leave them with more knowledge.
That's a very different vision for the profession.
And a natural vision, right? Every mature profession eventually learns that preserving knowledge is one responsibility and creating knowledge is another. The fiduciary profession has done an extraordinary job preserving what it has learned and passing it on from generation to generation. Perhaps the next chapter is discovering what it has yet to learn.
That seems like a pretty good place to leave it. And here's the thing, listeners, if you've been listening over the last several episodes, we've traveled from invisible risk, hence the invisible threat, to fiduciary discretion, to experience, to knowledge, and today to the institutions that make professional knowledge possible. Next time, we are going to begin exploring what a fiduciary research agenda might actually look like, not abstractly, but practically. If the profession is going to create new knowledge, what questions should it ask first? I want to thank you all for joining us for another episode of The Invisible Threat. Most organizations move past these moments. We don't. Dr. Matt, Joanne, thank you so much for keeping my intrigue going, for keeping our listeners' intrigue going. I mean, it's one of those, like, we started watching the show, ironically enough. I think a lot of people have started watching this or have already seen it, a show called Succession, right? Which is right in this wheelhouse. Well, each one of those shows, as me and Christina have been watching it, they leave us on this cliffhanger, right? You're like, I can't wait to see what happens on the next episode, right? So I'm hoping, I know it is for me, right? Because I know I'm going to be gaining from the knowledge that you're creating in real time sometimes. So I'm really excited about having our listeners come back and join us on our next episode. So Joanne, thank you as always for imparting your additional wisdom as we continue down this path.
It's been great. You can see it as if you go back to from the very beginning of this, how this is all matured and takes some turns and curves that we didn't anticipate. But all that stuff, you can't, and I've said this before, you don't know what's over the next horizon until you get to the top of the hill.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for being a great host, Carter. It's always great to see you. And Joanne, yeah, thanks for all the work that you do on this and keeping me down the straight and narrow and all my my ideas and thoughts. So thanks so much to the team. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, listeners, for The Invisible Threat, I am your host, Carter Wilcox, CEO and founder of Epic Services Company, along with my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby. Thanking you again for joining us. Make sure to, again, like, share, and subscribe wherever you do get your podcasts. And we will see you next time on The Invisible Threat. Thank you, everybody.